John Huston made damn sure that every day was a feast. He was a master at the avoidance of boredom. Hardly a week would pass without him encountering some extraordinary adventure. John Huston ate when he was hungry and drank when he was dry. He was his own man, living his own life. Tiger hunting in India, riding with the Mexican cavalry, leading the hunt as master of the hounds in County Galway. He was a pauper in London, a raconteur in Paris, a joker, a lover, a drinker, a gambler. And somehow along the way, he found the time to create motion pictures that will last as long as the medium itself. John Huston truly was a most remarkable man. I don't think there will ever be another quite like him.
Good evening, everybody. This is the show that's all about movies on your public radio station, KCBX, broadcasting from San Luis Obispo. And across the aisle for me is not one, but two Bobs. We've got Bob Robert Mitchum, who did our opening tonight, even though he's disappeared at the moment. The other Bob, my cohort in cinema, it's the one, the only, Bob Whiteford.
And across the aisle from me, the one, the only, the incomparable czar of film on the Central Coast, Mr. Jim Dee.
Great to see you, Bob.
Same here, Jimmy. Good to be back.
And
and if I may, just take a moment to wish my good friends John and Rainey Jones heartfelt congratulations on the birth of their son, Jasper Jones, born last Monday. Congratulations, kids. That's beautiful.
Congratulations. That's great news. Fabulous.
Absolutely.
Well, Bob, you know, since the inception of Take-Two, we've skirted around the incredible person of John Huston. And I know I've stopped in the middle of the show and said, Bob, we got to do a show on John Huston. The time has arrived. As you heard Robert Mitchum opening up the program tonight, the legend, John Huston, he left his mark on the film world, even though it almost seems like what a robust, full life. Films were a small part of what John Huston was, but will benefit from that legendary filmography forever. Incredible.
Absolutely, Jimmy. I mean, how many times over the 2 years we've been doing this show have we kind of collided or brought up the world of John Huston? I mean, his films live on today as some of the finest films ever made anywhere by anybody. And for my money, probably the best adapter of books to film of all time, ever.
I agree. Just for some of the basics, John Huston was born in 1906, August 5th. He was born in a very small town in Missouri. He passed away August 28th, 1987. He was still making movies pretty much right up to his death. And what a rich legend we're talking about here. He actually had his foot in the door with his father, who was a great entertainer and starred in many of John Huston's movies, Walter Huston. And I believe it was Walter Huston who sort of got him in as far as a screenwriter back in, the 30s or so with Warner Brothers. And came onto the scene with probably the quintessential gumshoe picture in 1941, The Maltese Falcon.
And this is kind of an interesting film, to say the least. This had been done twice before. In fact, I believe his father, Walter Huston, was in one of the versions shot back in 1930. And being this was his first time out at Warner's, what the old studio system used to do was go, okay, kid, you want to direct a picture? Let's dust something off. Let's remake something. Mm-hmm. So what did they? They picked The Maltese Falcon, based on the novel by the great mystery writer Dashiell Hammett. And while the other two versions are probably completely forgotten by now, this version, this film, which came out in 1941, was to change cinema. It was actually to really create or solidify a new genre of film, one that we've talked about many times, Jim, film noir. And as you were talking about before we went on the air, Jim, it's really the defining moment for Bogart when he's teamed with John Huston. This is to change everything. And this is one of the best films. It's got to be in my top 10, probably. I mean, it's a magnificent, wonderful film about, the search for this elusive bird or, statue or whatnot. And it's got Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre and Mary Astor. What a great cast.
What I think is important to note, too, Bob, is Bogart really, you said it before the program, Bogart became Bogart. He had some great, terrific roles prior to The Maltese Falcon in Petrified Forest as a gangster, as a
Duke Mantee.
Duke Mantee. I was looking for that name. He was in High Sierra again as a gangster, as a criminal. But it wasn't until The Maltese Falcon that he keeps that moral ambiguity as Detective Sam Spade. He's a tough guy. You think he's on the right track, but he's also a little morally ambiguous. He's kind of in it for himself. He's not going to take any guff from anybody, let alone, Peter Lorre coming into his office, and pulling a gun on him.
Poor Joel Cairo. He had no chance with his curly hair and bow tie. Well, you know what's interesting about this film, Jim? John Huston wanted Bogart to play Sam Spade. We talked about The Petrified Forest that came out in 1936, which Bogart couldn't have made if Leslie Howard, a big star, and a stand-up guy hadn't told Jack Warner, no Bogart, no Howard. And High Sierra, as Roy Earl, great film, but it was a role that was rejected by a guy who was always getting in Bogart's way as he was trying to find his place in Hollywood, George Raft. So he was taking Raft cast-offs and whatnot. This is the Bogart role. And it was only with Bogart in mind that John Huston did this.
And I think it's important to use the word quintessential gumshoe film. I mean, we've seen since The Maltese Falcon, your hard-boiled detective, film noir, whodunit sort of thing, but it was John Huston who really made it happen in The Maltese Falcon. And one thing I'm going to be probably repeating, and we're going to make this a two-part show. Hopefully we can cover the incredible career of John Huston in two shows, tonight and next week. But there is the undercurrent, at least for me personally, of John Huston, and that is he is a master at human nature, what it's like to be human. And it's almost as if that's the driving force on many of his films. You've got a great adventure story. You've got this thoroughly complicated whodunit with The Maltese Falcon. But at the core of it all, it's like, what makes humans tick? Why do they act a certain way? And we'll get into Treasure of the Sierra Madre a little bit later in the show. But here again, the undercurrent is what makes men tick? What makes them do certain things? And of course, the failures of their character, so easily drawn in by the lust for gold, or later on in The Man Who Would Be King, the lust to be a god. I mean, the failings of the human spirit as well, which he, I think John Huston loved his characters for their virtues and their failings, and that's what makes his films, timeless, I think.
Absolutely, Jim. And folks, you can't see the big smile Jim had on his face as he was saying that. I mean, this is a filmmaker who's made films that Jim and I, and probably a lot of you out there, are really passionate about how much we enjoy them. Mm-hmm. And Maltese Falcon is the first.
Yes. Let's listen to some of this incredible dialogue that John Huston put in The Maltese Falcon. And as I mentioned, the thing about human nature, here just setting up the conversation of Sidney Greenstreet, who is fabulous, with Sam Spade, Humphrey Bogart, and talking about that elusive black bird. This is from The Maltese Falcon.
You're a close-mouthed man?
I like to talk.
Better and better. I distrust a close-mouthed man. He generally picks the wrong time to talk and says the wrong things. Talking something you can't do judiciously unless you keep in practice. Now, sir, we'll talk if you like. I tell you right out, I'm a man who likes talking to a man who likes to talk.
Swell. Will we talk about the blackbird?
You're the man for me, sir. No beating about the bush, right to the point. Let's talk about the blackbird, by all means. Professor, answer me a question. Are you here as Miss O'Shaughnessy's representative?
Well, there's nothing certain either way. It depends.
Depends on? Maybe it depends on Joel Cairo.
Maybe.
The question is then which you represent. It'll be one or the other.
I didn't say so.
Who else is it?
There's me.
That's wonderful, sir, wonderful. I do like a man who tells you right out he's looking out for himself. Don't we all? I don't trust a man who says he's not.
Uh-huh. Now let's talk about the blackbird.
Let's. Mr. Spade, have you any conception of how much money can be got for that blackbird?
No.
Well, sir, if I told you half, you'd call me a liar.
No, not even if I thought so. But you tell me what it is, and I'll figure out the profit.
And that goes on because already I think a few people have died over this blackbird, the Maltese falcon. A lot of people want to get their hands on it. Sam Spade in the uncomfortable position of, finding it, keeping the people at bay who want it. And he's, caught up in this whirlwind of greed and people wanting to kill for this blackbird.
This film is loaded with great character performances. I mean, you have Jerome Cowan as his partner Miles, who with that slick back hair and the kind of weedy mustache, appropriately sleazy. He's bumped off pretty quickly. Lee Patrick playing his secretary, Girl Friday. She's just wonderful. I mean, what a great movie. Mm-hmm. And it just gets so complex watching Mary Astor dueling with Bogart, then toying with Peter Lorre. In fact, I think she even kicks his ass once. Boy, poor Peter Lorre. I mean, he must have been sitting there thinking, M got me this. I come to Hollywood and I'm beaten up by everybody. I mean, and Sidney Greenstreet, 61 years old, his very first movie. Oh. Incredible.
And, we're talking about John Huston being green at this point. This is his premiere film. He's in his, early 30s or so, and he's got such a mastery of the dialogue. He knows what he wants to do. There, in the re-release of Treasure of Sierra Madre, there's a wonderful documentary on the life of John Huston, and I was watching some of it today, and he was talking about how he didn't really need to direct that much because he felt his direction was already done in the casting. He already had what he needed, and he just had to sort of work with people who, in his mind, knew what he wanted, and therefore his direction wasn't overwhelming or overbearing because he felt the direction had already been done in the casting, which was very interesting to hear him say that today in this documentary.
Well, looking at this film, Jim, I mean, it's amazing that this is his first directorial effort. I mean, it's so well done. And, I mean, I don't know if there were any filmmakers ever that kind of hit the ground running with their first film, because the Maltese Falcon is not all that different from The Asphalt Jungle that would come 9 years later, which is also a great film. And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but for the first time out, this is an incredible effort.
Yes. Let's hear some dialogue again from the Maltese Falcon. And this is a tough scene. It is Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade talking to Mary Astor, who, after all it's said and done about the Black Bird, he does realize some things about Mary Astor's character. And this, Bogart and Mary Astor from the Maltese Falcon.
You told Thursby he was being followed.
I told him. Yes, but please believe me, Sam. I wouldn't have told him if I thought Floyd would kill him.
If you thought he wouldn't kill Miles, you were right, Angel. Miles hadn't many brains, but he'd had too many years' experience as a detective to be caught like that by a man he was shadowing up a blind alley with his gun in his hip and his overcoat buttoned. But he'd have gone up there with you, Angel. He was just dumb enough for that. He'd have looked you up and down and licked his lips and gone, grinning from ear to ear. And then you could have stood as close to him as you liked in the dark and put a hole through him with the gun you got from Thursby that evening.
Don't, Sam, don't say that.
Stop it, the police will be here any minute. Now talk.
Oh, why do you accuse me?
This isn't the time for that schoolgirl act. We're both of us sitting under the gallows. Now, why did you shoot Miles?
I didn't mean to at first. Really, I didn't. But when I found out that Floyd couldn't be frightened, I can't look at you and tell you this.
You thought Thursby would tackle Miles and one or the other of them would go down. If Thursby was killed, you were rid of him. If it was Miles, you see that Thursby was caught and sent up for it. Isn't that right?
Something like that.
And when you found that Thursby wasn't going to tackle him, you borrowed his gun and did it yourself, right? And when you heard Thursby was shot, you knew Gutman was in town. And you knew you needed another protector, somebody to fill Thursby's boots. So you came back to me.
Yes. But oh, sweetheart, it wasn't only that. I'd have come back to you sooner or later. From the very first instant I saw you, I knew.
Well, if you get a good break, you'll be out of Tehachapi in 20 years, and you can come back to me then. I hope they don't hang you, Precious, for that sweet neck.
You're not.
Yes, Angel, I'm going to send you over. The chances are you'll get off with life. That means if you're a good girl, you'll be out in 20 years. I'll be waiting for you. If they hang you, I'll always remember you.
Don't, Sam. Don't say that even in fun. Oh, I was frightened for a minute. I really thought you do such wild and unpredictable things.
Now, don't be silly. You're taking the fall.
Ooh.
And let's face it, Tehachapi, our Neil Losey's hometown. You know, we just thought I'd throw that in too. Tehachapi.
You know, what's interesting about this, Bob, too, is the idea that Sam Spade is somewhat morally ambiguous, but in this scene, you know, he does have a moral code in the fact that even though he's having a relationship with Mary Astor, they're calling each other Angel and Sweetheart, she ended up, you know, murdering one of the people in the film, and
murdered his business partner, who he happened to be having an affair with his wife. But you know, again, that moral ambiguity.
Oh, man.
But I think his professional code demanded that he nail Miles's killer.
Yes.
And he does.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because you know he's having a relationship with her. You would, you know, update it to this time where, you know, he's having a relationship with a woman. Maybe she ended up doing something good. I'm talking about hypothetically. In this movie, Mary Astor did do the murder. Sam Spade is going to send her up the river,
and that's kind of setting the noir framework. You know, there's nothing more dangerous than a dame, and in this case, Bogart figures that out 3/4 of the way through and is able to turn the tables on her as opposed to her turning the table. It could have gone either way, but
Boy.
Bogart, a little slicker.
Wow. So the debut of John Huston, The Incredible Maltese Falcon, 1941, and then some of the other pictures he did after that. In 42, he made 2 pictures, In This Our Life and Across the Pacific. In 43, uncredited apparently, Report from the Aleutians, Tunisian Victory from 1944, San Pietro 1945, and then, Bob, I got to tell you, you know, as much as I revere John Huston, today I had additional new reverence because I watched some of Let There Be Light from 1946. I got to tell you, my jaw dropped. I was absolutely amazed. I didn't see the whole thing. I want to watch the whole thing. This picture is so timely. I'm talking about Let There Be Light by John Huston, written and directed in 1946. And the focus of this film, which is essentially a documentary, is on men coming home from war and the tragedies of being shell-shocked, of having amnesia, and looking at the casualties of war. None of these men in this picture had lost limbs or anything. They were all sitting in a group, and they're casualties of war. And I was just utterly fascinated. I think this film should be shown now. It is more timely than ever. I was just amazed today when I watched some of this film.
Well, here's a little background on films such as Let There Be Light and Battle of San Pietro. Right after Maltese Falcon, of course, I believe that came out in late 1941. We know what happened, or most of us know, December 7th, 1941, the U.S. entered World War II. In 1942, upon completion of the film Across the Pacific with Humphrey Bogart, Mary Astor, and Sidney Greenstreet, which is not a bad film, but it certainly wasn't in the class of Maltese Falcon, John Huston, like John Ford and George Stevens, went into the military and was part of the Army's film unit. John Ford was in the Navy's film unit. George Stevens was in the Army film unit too. And John Huston first went to the Aleutians and did a film called Report from the Aleutians, a 40-minute documentary on the retaking of Attu and Kiska Island in early 1943. Pretty interesting film, but very pedestrian in its approach, kind of oh shucks, propaganda to be sure. You might think of Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. This was part of it as well. Things changed when he went to Italy in late 1943 to do the Battle of San Pietro. And I think this was a critical time for Huston as a filmmaker because it was very much an eye-opening experience. He was assigned to follow a company from the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division, to try and capture this town called San Pietro, which was in a German defense perimeter. I think it was called either the Gothic Line or the Caesar Line. It was right in front of the fabled Monte Cassino Cathedral, which was arguably, we still don't know whether the Germans were using it as a outpost, but they sure were after we bombed the place and destroyed it, but that's another story. This battle led up to it, and he was assigned to film a American victory. It's like you go in with them, you film us as we take the town. Okay, said John Huston. Small problem. Italy, aside from being a very beautiful country and rich in history, in terms of warfare, it's built for defense. You have coastal plains on its Adriatic and Mediterranean coast, but in the middle of the country, it's all hills and mountains. So it's a natural defensive line. And what happened that winter was it was raining very heavily. Needless to say, our attack was an abysmal failure, and what he caught was our guys fighting desperately and losing, being defeated. He came back with all this footage, and the Army was like, no, we've got to have a victory. Go back with the counterattack and film that. Well, we finally took the town. Eventually the Germans we wore them down enough where they left, and we took the town. And when he filmed the village of San Pietro, it had been completely destroyed by the fighting. And unfortunately for the Army, he also filmed a lot of civilian casualties that were killed by the American bombardment in general. And there's a scene of dead civilians being pulled out of rubble, and you can see the shock look on the Americans' faces. They didn't, they were horrified at what they had done, and here's all these villagers screaming and crying, and I don't know how This was done in 1943. It took 2 years of severe editing to make this even look like a film of an American victory. Coming off of that, Jim, he was assigned to do a film about shell-shock veterans, the film you mentioned, Let There Be Light. And let me say, Jim isn't kidding about this. This film is very powerful. These are issues of shell-shock, post-traumatic stress, which we're all very familiar with in the wake of the Vietnam War, and we know for a fact that all soldiers, Marines, fighting people, men, women, when they come back, they face these kind of traumas. Audie Murphy, he won every medal America had to give and became a movie star himself. And John Huston cast him in Red Badge of Courage. He suffered from this. But this film is so powerful, and I'm talking about Let There Be Light, that the Army kept it censored for over 30 years. It was finished in 1946. It never saw the light of day until, I believe, 1978 or 79. Wow. And you can see why, Jim. You saw it. And this is Huston filming some very powerful stuff while a member of the Army. So it isn't a studio head. He's filming stuff, and they're saying, no, 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 no. And for the first time in his life, creatively speaking, he's running up against roadblocks. Boy. And he's seeing things that he's having a problem with. Granted, this guy he lived a hell-raising life. This was a guy that was not impartial to drinking and fist-fighting and being a tough guy, and probably not too great with his women. Actor Evelyn Keyes comes to mind. Pretty stormy relationship. He was also friends with the great artist Man Ray. I mean, he dug Marquise de Sade. I mean, he was into some pretty wild stuff, but this war experience really changed him, like it did George Stevens, like it did Jimmy Stewart. And I'm probably going on too long about this. But this sets the table for the films he was to do after the war.
I'll go back to my comments about John Huston's passion for human nature, what makes humans tick and everything. And I was watching this today, Bob, and I was comparing it to the Iraq War. Now we have soldiers coming home with wounded. It's numbering in the thousands, and we already know that these brave fighting men and women's lives are going to be changed without a limb, or they're in a wheelchair, or whatever it is. What I found so fascinating watching part of Let There Be Light is these guys came walking into a hospital, and they're all sitting there, and they don't have great looks on their faces, but they are wounded emotionally and psychologically. And I just thought, here's John Huston taking on something that, we'll see a veteran of a war, and he looks completely intact, but we want to look at what's inside the man or woman's head, and that's what John Huston does so amazingly in this film. In fact, we do have a clip from Let There Be Light, and I really like you to listen to this one closely. This is a film made in 1946. As Bob said, it had been suppressed for 30 years. But listen to this. This is John Huston narrating his own film, Let There Be Light. His comments are on shell-shocked and otherwise damaged soldiers.
These are the casualties of the spirit, the troubled in mind, men who are damaged emotionally. Born and bred in peace, educated to hate war, they were overnight plunged into sudden and terrible situations. Every man has his breaking point, and these, in the fulfillment of their duties as soldiers, were forced beyond the limit of human endurance.
At ease, man. On behalf of the commanding officer and his staff of Mason General Hospital, I want to extend a hearty welcome to all of you on your return to the United States. There's no need to be alarmed at the presence of these cameras, as they're making a photographic record of your progress at this hospital from the date of admission to the date of discharge.
Here are men who tremble, men who cannot sleep, men with pains that are nonetheless real because they are of mental origin, men who cannot remember, paralyzed men whose paralysis is dictated by the mind. However different the symptoms, these things they have in common: unceasing fear and apprehension, a sense of impending disaster, a feeling of hopelessness and utter isolation.
Boy, what a film. That's from Let There Be Light, written and directed by John Huston, focusing on war casualties. And these are men who don't have any physical, aftermath, no physical appearances of any losing any limbs, but mentally they need desperate help. It's such a timely film, and I'm going to go back and watch the entire film, Bob.
And I might interject here, narrated by his dad, Walter Huston.
Oh, that was Walter, or was
Yes.
that John? Ah, boy. Okay. Well, folks, I highly recommend Let There Be Light. It's maybe almost uncomfortable at this time in history with what's going on in the world, but boy, it was just an eye-opener for me and a further reverence for the great John Huston. I highly recommend Let There Be Light from 1946.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. I mean, this is a film that really lets us in. Being civilians, we don't always, we can't know what soldiers feel, but this one, at least it opens our eyes to a lot of things that we couldn't see otherwise. Brilliant work. Very important film.
We're talking about John Huston on the movie program, Take Two. This is Public Radio, KCBX San Luis Obispo, KSBX Santa Barbara. Time to head over to the concession stand, refresh our drink and our popcorn. We'll be back with more on John Huston in just a moment.
I wanna go to the movie show, me and my baby. Come on, let's go. On to the movie show. Let's go. I buy the popcorn as soon as we hit the door. My two brothers, Bill and Pons, sitting in the front row. They bought the candy. We don't need nothing more. I love a movie show, I tell you, in black and white.
Tonight's Take Two is sponsored by the Look Young Center, offering the latest techniques in aesthetic medicine, including Botox and collagen, administered by board-certified physicians. In San Luis Obispo at 597-8349. Funds for Take Two are also provided in part by Morin Brothers Automotive, starring Frida, the dog of many alter egos, who is always glad to sniff your tires. Morin Brothers Automotive on Broad Street near Tank Farm Road.
I love the movies. Clark Gable, all the women out there, the Barrymores and Sidney Poitier.
We're back on Take Two, and we are relishing tonight's subject, actually the subject for next week, because it's hard to cram in everything that we want to talk about, the great John Huston.
Boy, I mean, this is amazing. We've gone through the first half hour of the show, Jim, and we've talked about Maltese Falcon and the films he made when he was in the Army in World War II. Talk about a rich vein to mine. We weren't kidding.
You know, it's funny, Bob. I was thinking today too, when they throw out the top 10 movies, top 100 movies, I always think, Citizen Kane always makes the top 10, and Godfather is usually in there. I can't think of some others, but for some reason, I'm not sure if Huston is in there. For me, he's just as timeless as Citizen Kane would be, as The Godfather would be. I'm sure he's in the top 100, but for me personally, the great films of John Huston. And I'll make a note that some of his films are real turkeys. Every one of them isn't a masterpiece, but the masterpieces are masterpieces.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, especially early in his career, it seems like from 1941 with Maltese Falcon well into the 50s, maybe even early 60s, I can't think of a dud he made. He did make some later on, but that'll be in part 2.
And, you know, I do want to direct you to the documentary that is out there. It's part of the re-release of Treasure of Sierra Madre on DVD, and we have taken some material from that. But there was one comment in there from one of his partners or one of his co-workers, and the fact that he knew from the start of a film whether John Huston was making the film for himself or for money, which he did. There were films that he just, probably want to take the paycheck home. I mean, he was a filmmaker, but he also had to pay the bills. But I think in some of the ones we're discussing tonight, Maltese Falcon, and we're going to move on to the great Treasure of Sierra Madre right now. You know that Huston's heart and soul and incredible intelligence was at work with these films, and especially, one of his great classics, Treasure of Sierra Madre from 1948, I believe.
And what's interesting about this, Jim, is this film did not do well at all when it came out.
And it had a big budget.
Huge budget.
Yes.
And this was viewed at Warner Brothers as Huston's return, the first film he had made since he got out of the Army, and reuniting him with Bogart, and it was a financial failure. But luckily for us, the film is there. It's way better appreciated by later generations, and the film is now regarded as an all-time classic.
And good old John Huston, we've talked about him being a director, as a writer, but he was also an actor in many films. And in this case, in Treasure of Sierra Madre, he makes 3 appearances. Each time the Humphrey Bogart character, Fred C. Dobbs, panhandles him. And he wears a white suit. He looks like he's a well-to-do guy down in Mexico. And Bogart hits him up for money no less than 3 times.
Pretty interesting.
Here's the 3rd time where Fred C. Dobbs confronts a young John Huston in Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Hey, mister, will you take a fellow American to a meal?
Such impudence never came my way. Early this afternoon I gave you money. While I was having my shoes polished, I gave you more money. Now you put the bite on me again. Do me a favor, will you? Go occasionally to somebody else. It's beginning to get tiresome.
Oh, excuse me, mister. I never knowed it was you. I never looked at your face. I just looked at your hands and the money you gave me. Beg pardon, mister. I promise I'll never put the bite on you again.
This is the very last you get from me. Just to make sure you don't forget your promise, here's another peso.
Thanks, mister. Thanks.
But from now on, you have to make your way through life without my assistance.
That's John Huston giving Bogart a peso or 2 pesos just to get him off his back. And it's interesting too, Bob, I was watching this clip, John Huston looks pretty young in this. He's very tall. In fact, he's 6'4", I was reading in his stats. He sort of towers over Bogart, who was rather short. But then here he is, the master of this film, directing Bogart, and then, of course, directing his father, Walter Huston.
And imagine, he was very close to his father. They had a very close relationship. I think his father and Bogart were probably 2 of the very few people who he really loved and admired. And the thought of directing his father, too, an Academy Award-winning performance. Well, it was just, I would dare I say it, this was probably the greatest moment in film in his whole life. And this was based on I think it was the B. Traven novel, The Mysterious B. Traven. The fellow who wrote the Treasure of Sierra Madre, very mysterious fellow. It was alleged that he was on the set, but nobody knew who he was, except John Huston. Huston would meet with him secretly and discuss the filming. But this is a fascinating film. John Huston, as we mentioned earlier, created the Bogart persona. In this film, he does a little tweaking of the Bogart persona, which is why I think it didn't go over so big. Bogart isn't heroic here. He isn't even jaded. He's cruel, shallow, cowardly. He's a stinker.
He is.
And he's marvelous at it.
But I'll go back to my comment about John Huston's insight into human nature, because I still think he loved the Fred C. Dobbs character. As lowly as he might be, he's this poor sucker who gets sucked into what happens to you when you've got a treasure in front of you. You've got piles and bags of gold hanging over your burrows, and it's like your mind starts going, or it's just like, oh, are they out to get me? The paranoia starts setting into a guy who doesn't have both feet firmly on the ground. Fred C. Dobbs doesn't.
And Jim, you'd mentioned earlier, and I think it's a brilliant statement about Huston, how he would direct, and he would basically do it through the casting. And look at the three guys who go on. You got Bogart, you got Walter Huston, and you got Tim Holt.
He's great.
Tim Holt, a very underrated actor star. He was in Orson Welles' Magnificent Ambersons. He was a B-movie cowboy, did a lot of RKO, like 59-minute B-westerns shot out in the Alabama hills as himself, Tim Holt. And I always had a soft spot for him. And in this film, against two dynamos, Bogart and Walter Huston, Tim Holt holds his ground very well. And he's kind of the moral core. He's the guy who has a sense of right and wrong. Walter Huston, he does too. He could care less about being rich, and when they lose all the gold, he seems to just think it's the funniest thing he's ever, and that's why I think this film works. You have those three really interesting characters off in the elements, facing the desert and the Mexican banditos. I mean, who has not who's forgotten that scene where badges? We don't wear no stinking badges.
Oh, but that's that's the quote you hear from Treasurer Sarah Madry. That's part of it. This very lengthy scene where when Bogart is approached by these Mexican bandits, they're kind of fun. They're kind of funny, and they go from being kind of, hey, what do you got in the bags, senor? And they go from being kind of these fun guys meeting on the trail to very dangerous, scary.
And it happens almost in the drop of a sombrero.
Yes. Very well said. Well, here's a couple of clips. In fact, we can play both of these. We won't play both of them, but here again is the insight of John Huston in the character of Walter Huston in Treasurer Sierra Madre, where this is what happens to men who go searching for gold and don't quite know what to do with it.
Real bonanzas are few and far between that take a lot of finding. Say, answer me this one, will you? Why is gold worth some $20 an ounce?
I don't know, because it's scarce.
1,000 men say go searching for gold. After 6 months, one of them's lucky. 1 out of the 1,000. His find represents not only his own labor, but that of 999 others to boot. That's 6,000 months or 500 years, scrabbling over mountains, going hungry and thirsty. An ounce of gold, mister, is worth what it is because of the human labor that went into the finding and the getting of it.
Never thought of it just like that.
Well, there's no other explanation, mister. Gold itself ain't good for nothing except for making jewelry with gold teeth. Gold's a devilish sort of a thing anyway. You start out, you tell yourself you'll be satisfied with 25,000 handsome smackers worth of it. So help my Lord and cross my heart. Fine resolution. After months of sweating yourself dizzy and growing short on provisions and finding nothing, you finally come down to 15,000, then 10. Finally you say, Lord, let me just find $5,000 worth and never ask for anything more the rest of my life.
$5,000 is a lot of money.
Yeah, here in this joint seems like a lot, but I tell you, if it was to make a real strike, you couldn't be dragged away. Not even the threat of miserable death would keep you from trying to add 10,000 more. 10, you'd want to get 25, 25, you want to get 50, 50, 100, like roulette. One more turn, always one more.
It wouldn't be that way with me. I swear it wouldn't. I'd take only what I set out to get, even if there was still $500,000 worth lying around waiting to be picked up.
I've dug in Alaska and Canada and Colorado. I was with the crowd in the British Honduras, where it made my fare back home and almost enough over to cure me of the fever I'd caught. Dug in California and Australia, all over the world practically. Yeah, I know what gold does to men's souls.
Yes, Walter Huston does know what gold does to men's souls, as does John Huston, who wrote this incredible script. And just to move right along, we will now hear Fred C. Dobbs, portrayed by Humphrey Bogart, and Tim Holt, and we will listen to what does happen to men's souls when there's bags of gold hanging over a bunch of burros.
How far away do you suppose the railroad is?
Oh, not so far as the crow flies.
We ain't crows.
I figure we can reach the high pass in 2 days more. After that, it'll be 3 or 4 days to the railroad. That's figuring no hard luck on the trail, of course. What's the joke, Dobbsy? Aren't you going to let me in on it?
In on it? Sure I will. Sure.
Well, go ahead and spill it. What's so funny?
I was just thinking what a bonehead play that old jackass made when he put all his goods in our keeping.
How do you mean?
Figured let us do his sweating for him, did he? Well, we'll show him.
What are you getting at?
Oh, man, can't you see it's all ours? We don't go back to Durango at all, savvy? Not at all.
I don't follow you, Dobbsy.
Oh, don't be such a sap. Where did you ever grow up? All right, to make it clear to a dumbhead like you, we take all his goods and go straight up north and leave the old jackass flat.
You aren't serious, are you? You don't really mean what you're saying.
Fred C. Dobbs don't say nothing he don't mean.
As long as I'm here and can do anything about it, you won't touch a single grain of the old man's goods.
I know exactly what you mean. You want to take it all for yourself and cut me out.
No, Dobbs. I'm on the level with the old man, just as I'd be on the level with you if you weren't here.
Get off your soapbox, will you? You only sound foolish out here in this wilderness. I know you for what you are. For a long time I've had my suspicions about you. Now I know I've been right.
What suspicions are you talking about?
Oh, you're not putting anything over on me. I see right through you. For a long time you've had it in your mind to bump me off at the first good opportunity and bury me out here in the bush like a dog. So you could take not only the old man's goods, but mine in the bargain. And when you get to Durango safely, you'll have a big laugh, won't you? Thinking how dumb the old man and I were. You make another move toward me and I'll pull the trigger. All right, get your hands up. Come on, get 'em up! Was I right, or was I? You and your Sunday school talk about protecting people's goods. You. Come on, stand up and take it like a man.
Ooh.
Wow.
As Walter Huston said before, he knows what gold does to men's souls, and you could just, the paranoia creeping in Bogart, incredible. And, you know, to tell you more about Treasure Sierra Madre, I assume that you've seen it. If you haven't seen it, I think just to talk a little bit more about it won't ruin it for you, because what happens after that scene is there's an altercation with a gun, and Tim Holt is, well, he's wounded, let's just say. Bogart thinks he's killed him. In the next scene, Bogart is just a wreck because he's wondering what to do. You know, he's got to go back and do something with Tim Holt's body because he realized that he killed him. And Huston, the genius of the direction, he drags the scene on so long. In fact, well, maybe I should go back and cover him up. Well, no, I'll get to the railroad. He goes, no, you know, well, I'll let the ants eat him. And he goes, no, you know, and then he starts getting the burros off, and then he starts thinking to himself, and it just goes on, and you're just waiting for that moment where Bogart is going to go back where Tim Holt was, and he hasn't because he's crawled off. And you're just waiting for this moment for Fred C. Dobbs to go back and find that he's not there. And it goes on and on and on. And Bogart finally says, you know, well, the buzzards will take care of him. And he goes, oh my gosh, you know, circling buzzards, somebody will see that, will find him. He says, oh, thank goodness. I mean, Huston just takes you more and more to the point where, you know, he stretches it out to linger this moment where Fred C. Dobbs is going to discover that Tim Holt is gone. It's genius.
Absolutely. And Bogart is incredible in this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's safe to say he did his best work with John Huston. And this is, again, a film. In fact, I was watching the Today Show this morning, having a cup of coffee. I don't know why I watch it, to tell you the truth. I feel I got to do something. But they had some film critics on there saying that the Fred C. Dobbs role was one of the greatest film characterizations in film history. I never like when they create these lists of, you know, what's the... Yeah, I mean, But I thought that was kind of interesting that they would have chosen that over, say, Rick Blaine in Casablanca or Marlowe, you know, in Maltese Falcon. Oh, no, was it
Sam Spade.
Sam Spade. Yeah, I'm thinking of The Big Sleep. Sorry, folks.
But, I think, well, for me personally, Bob, just seeing Bogart fall apart. I mean, to me, the greatness of Bogart, I made a tangent here off of John Huston, but like in The Caine Mutiny, where you see this man fall apart. I mean, Bogart could be the suave, the greatest screen hero in Casablanca as Rick, but then you see him in Treasure of Sierra Madre, and as you said, he is quite a despicable character, and yet you know that John Huston loves this character.
Oh, absolutely. He cherishes every evil thought, every weakness in him. Huston is just, you could see him just like, oh, that's wonderful. Well, it's an interesting analogy, Jim, because we know one of the great Bogart performances is as Commander Philip Queeg in The Caine Mutiny. I think he won a Best Supporting Actor for that in 1954. Directed by Stanley Kramer, and in terms of a creative lineage, you can see a connection between Fred C. Dobbs and Lieutenant Commander Queeg. I mean, they're weak, and their directors, and I think Huston forged this, is like just lovingly just working that weakness and that madness and working that frenzy in a way that wasn't really done in films before. You can't have your main character fall apart and become all wigged out over gold and have his weaknesses be the driving force of the film. It's usually his strength, his ramrod strength. The bad guy's weak, but here's your main character. He's weak and he's selfish, and we're going to go from there.
Yes.
Huston's a genius.
Well, there again, there's that human nature, and sometimes I think of all the main characters in Treasure of Sierra Madre, somewhat like Huston. He was a gambler. He apparently lost huge amounts of money. Like you said, he was a womanizer. He was an adventurer. So I almost can see John Huston himself in the Walter Huston character being the sage and knowing the ins and outs of panning for gold as well as human nature. Then you've got the selfish Fred C. Dobbs, who, as I said, Huston, I guess, lost 50 grand in one poker game.
How many
or something.
times did he get the fever at the roulette wheel or at the poker table? Probably every time.
Yes.
He had 25,000. Why not go for 50,000?
Yes,
yeah,
boy.
That's who Huston wrote that. That's a guy who knows gambling.
Yes. I think we're just going to be able to make it to Key Largo, and then there was one clip what we want to play near the end of the show, which is Hank number 14, but right now it's Key Largo, and we're talking about, I believe, 1948, 49.
Right.
We're post-war, and what's very interesting to factor in the war films that we're talking about John Huston did, as well as Let There Be Light. Key Largo. We're talking about post-war. We're talking about a little more cynicism. We're talking about the heroics that we might have seen in Casablanca, which, Casablanca is not a John Huston film, but we're talking about the heroism that's displayed in Casablanca. We're talking post-war now, and things are a little bit less black and white, a lot less black and white. There's more shades of gray. There's disillusionment. There's it's just not what it was cracked up to be as coming out of this conflict, and you're thinking, oh, victory, but boy, there's an after effect, there's a trail left that isn't so wonderfully heroic, that just doesn't make you feel good.
Well, I think at the end of the Second World War, so much we really felt, the sacrifices we were making, and they were considerable back then, that the world would be a better place. And I think that's in good part why we won that war. And here we are a few years after the war is over, and Bogart's character, probably when he got out of the army at the end of the war, he's a hero. He's going to visit a family of a friend of his who was killed in the war. He probably had some emotional issues he wanted to deal with, or maybe find a reason to try to find that spark again, to remove the veil of disillusionment. And he runs into Johnny Rocco.
Johnny Rocco. Edward G. Robinson was never better. In fact, I think John Huston took his gangster persona and really, I mean, I was watching some of this today, Bob, and boy, Edward G. Robinson is downright scary in this film.
Sinister.
Here's a clip from Key Largo, written and directed by John Huston, and it's Bogey, Edward G. Robinson, and Lionel Barrymore.
Sir? Johnny Rocco was more than a king, he was an emperor. His rule extended over beer, slot machines, the numbers racket, and a dozen other forbidden enterprises. He was a master of the fix. Whom he couldn't corrupt, he terrified. Whom he couldn't terrify, he murdered.
You filth. You city filth.
Oh, Mr. Temple, you're hopelessly old-fashioned. Your ideas date back years. You're still living in the time when America thought it could get along without the Johnny Roccos. Welcome back, Rocco. It was all a mistake. America's sorry for what it did to you.
On the level, boss. Were you that big?
On the level, are you that dumb?
Yeah. Yeah, that's me. Sure, I was all of those things. And more. When Rocco talked, everybody shut up and listened. What Rocco said went. Nobody was big as Rocco. It'll be like that again, only more so. I'll be back up there one of these days, and then you're gonna really see something.
If the time ever comes when your kind can walk a city street in daylight with nothing to fear from the people.
The time has come, Mr. Temple. It's here.
Okay. You know all about me. Now, what's with you, wise guy? Well, Gib, in the war, weren't you?
Yes?
Get any medals?
Couple.
Brave, huh?
Not very.
Why'd you stick your neck out?
No good reason.
What are you saying, Frank?
I believed some words.
Words? What words?
Well, they went like this. But we are not making all this sacrifice of human effort and human lives to return to the kind of a world we had after the last World War. We're fighting to cleanse the world of ancient evils, ancient ills.
What's that all about? I remember those words.
Well, that makes two of us.
And that ambiguity, the disillusionment, is apparent in this film that wasn't there 10 years before, or 5-6 years before.
Those words could have been said over the graves of the American soldiers killed at San Pietro. Those words could have been said about the American soldiers that were traumatized in Let There Be Light. This seems very autobiographical for Huston. He's purging himself of those demons, I think, anyway.
Well, definitely things changed over the course of the 40s, from the late 40s, just the feeling. It was very different than a few years before.
Very much so.
Well, folks, we've blasted through this hour in a subject that both Bob and I love, John Huston. We're going to continue next week. We have one more clip. This is from the documentary about John Huston, and you'll recognize the voice. I'll tell you. It's Burgess Meredith talking about a young John Huston, perhaps an event in his life that spearheaded all of his incredible adventurousness and his incredible career as filmmaker, writer, director, painter. We didn't get into that. We'll get into that next week. I want to thank you for listening. And Bob, a pleasure to talk about John Huston with you.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful to be able to do this. And thanks, everybody. And we'll catch you next week with part 2 of the John Huston Show.
The shadow of death first passed over John Huston at an early age. When he was 12 years old, he was mistakenly diagnosed as having an enlarged heart. In his eyes, the end was near, and the boy decided that he must indulge in one last swim before dying. One night, John crept out of his bedroom window. He made his way to a nearby canal, stripped, and dove in. He had such a marvelous time that he did it again a couple of nights later. And this time, to his horror, he found himself caught in the current of a floodgate. The swirling canal dragged him under, and he thought he was drowned for sure. When suddenly, he was shot out the other side of the dam in a great geyser of water. He was all right. As the days passed, he returned again and again to ride the waterfall. Years later, the noted film critic James A.G. observed, "The traits revealed in this incident are central and permanent in Huston's character. Risk, not to say recklessness, are virtual reflexes. Action and the most vivid possible use of the immediate present is personal salvation."